Introduction. The life, career, and assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. are among the most significant and studied events in American history. As a prominent civil rights leader, King's legacy has profoundly impacted the struggle for racial justice in the United States and around the world. Martin Luther King Jr. was the modern-day prophet and most powerful influencer who demonstrated that peace is the most powerful asset. The early years. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. His parents were Martin Luther King Sr., who was a pastor, and Alberta Williams King, who was a schoolteacher, along with his older sister Christine and younger brother Alfred Daniel Williams. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in Atlanta's sweet Auburn neighborhood. He was raised by a loving and encouraging family, reminding him of morals and to have compassion. His community was composed of the most prominent and prosperous African Americans in the country, experiencing discrimination and segregation. MLK was a gifted student and a member of his high school debate team. He developed a reputation for his powerful speaking skills, tone of voice, and extensive vocabulary. This foundation was instrumental in years to come. From a young age, Martin Luther King Jr.'s path was strongly influenced by several important men. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., Benjamin Mays, Mohandas Gandhi, and Howard Thurman. These significant figures enlightened the man Martin Luther King Jr. became and enlightened the world through him. Throughout Martin Luther King Jr.'s youth, he was strongly influenced by his father, Martin Luther King Sr. During a pilgrimage, Martin Luther King Jr.'s father was so moved by the philosophy of a 16th century monk named Martin Luther that he changed his own and his 5-year-old son Michael King Jr.'s names to Martin Luther King. This father and son name change is just one dramatic measure of the influence of Martin Luther. In addition to being a pastor, Martin Luther King Sr. was also a local leader of organizations such as Atlantic Civic and Political League and the Nation Association for Advancement of Colored People. When Martin Luther King Jr. was 7 years old, his father organized a march that resulted in hundreds of African Americans walking to Atlanta City Hall to protest voting rights discrimination. His father's faith and actions for justice were the start of Martin Luther King Jr.'s path for civil rights. At age 15, Martin Luther King Jr. attended Morehouse College, where his father attended. Benjamin Mays was the president of the school at the time. Mr. Mays became one of King's mentors in the early life. King characterized Mays as a spiritual mentor and intellectual father. He taught Martin Luther King Jr. to integrate the importance of history in his speeches, and was a counselor for many of his speeches in the years to come. While studying at Crozer Theological Seminary, Martin Luther King Jr. was introduced to Mohandas Gandhi's works. Gandhi protested against racism in South Africa and colonial rule in India by using nonviolent resistance. Martin Luther King Jr. researched and studies Gandhi's ideas of nonviolent actions and has said, "Christ showed us the way and Gandhi in India showed it could work." Martin Luther King Jr. connected Gandhi's works to those of Jesus. In the Bible, Jesus tells his followers to love your enemies. Martin Luther King Jr. believed strongly in the idea of love. After the seminary, Martin Luther King Jr.'s education expanded to Boston University to study theology. He became inspired by Professor Howard Thurman. While King read many books about Gandhi, it was Howard Thurman who first introduced the concept of nonviolence and civil disobedience to the young pastor. In his sermons and his classes, he inspired Martin Luther King Jr. and other students committed to social justice who would participate in the civil rights movement. While in Boston, Martin Luther King Jr. met Coretta Scott, a young singer from Alabama who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. The couple wed in 1953 and settled in Montgomery, Alabama, where MLK became a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. They had 4 children: Yolanda Denise King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice Albertine King. After completing his studies, King began his work with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Through this association, King became a prominent leader in the civil rights movement. King's first major organized movement was the Montgomery bus boycott. This boycott began after the arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery City bus to a white passenger. The Montgomery bus boycott was a social campaign that lasted from December 1st, 1955 to December 20th, 1956, aimed to end racial segregation on public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. The boycott was a refusal of any participants to stop using any form of public transportation. During the boycott, African Americans in Montgomery walked, carpooled, and took African American owned taxi businesses to transport around town. The boycott received national attention and catapulted Dr. King as a prominent figure in the civil rights movement. After a year, the boycott was successful, and the Supreme Court deemed segregation on public transportation unconstitutional. Dr. King's most famous civil rights movement was the March on Washington. The march took place on August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C. Around 250,000 peaceful protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, where they listened to speeches by civil rights leaders, activists, and even musicians. This is where the iconic I Have a Dream speech by Dr. King took place. In the speech, Dr. King outlined his vision for a future with racial equality.
With its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Assassination. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated on the second-floor balcony of the Loran Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The fateful day that Martin Luther King Jr. met his end was one of the most tragic events in American history. The death of such a prominent figure who inspired hope and pride in so many led to a period of national mourning. Furthermore, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the anti-war movement were all in full swing, further contributing to the tragedy of Martin Luther King's assassination. Immediately after the assassination, civil unrest and rioting happened all across cities in the United States. The situation got so dire that in Washington, D.C., a curfew was imposed and the National Guard had to come in order to reestablish order. Sadly, this violence was contrary to King's message, as it resulted in numerous deaths and injuries, and it further heightened tensions between black and white Americans. Another tragic aspect of the death of Martin Luther King was the loss of such an established leader. James Earl Ray was the man responsible for the assassination of MLK. He escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary in 1967 by hiding in a truck transporting bread from the prison bakery. On April 4th, 1968, Ray shot and killed King while he was standing on the balcony of the Loran Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. While King's death was a tragic loss, his vision for a more just society lived on and continued to inspire the civil rights movement in the years to come. In conclusion, the life, career, and tragic assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. marked an indelible chapter in the history of the civil rights movement, and have left an enduring legacy in the fight for equality and justice. Born into a segregated society, King emerged as a prominent leader and advocate for nonviolence resistance, inspiring millions with his powerful oratory and unwavering commitment to achieving racial equality. His early experiences, marked by the influence of his family, education, and religious upbringing, shaped his values and propelled him into the forefront of the struggle for civil rights. Through these initiatives and his tireless efforts, King challenged the discriminatory laws and practices of the time, demanding equal rights for African Americans and advocating for social and economic justice. However, King's impactful journey was tragically cut short on April 4th, 1968, when he was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. His assassination sent shockwaves across the nation and deeply impacted the civil rights movement, leaving a profound void in the struggle for equality. Martin Luther King Jr. will forever be known as a modern-day prophet and most powerful influencer for racial justice.